The limestone dust bites at your tongue as the wind moves across the hill. And right in front of you stands a T-shaped stone, taller than a man, cut from rock and still shouldering the sky. That is Göbekli Tepe, the temple older than agriculture. And that is the part that does not sit right. This place is more than 11,000 years old, built before pottery, before metal, before the wheel, before writing, before farming as we know it. The people who raised it were hunter-gatherers. Look at the scale for a second. These pillars rise to around 5.5 meters, and some weigh as much as a small house. They are set in circular enclosures, carved from limestone, with animal figures pressed into the stone like warnings. So the first question is not who they were. It is how a pre-pottery world found the power to do this at all, and why it later buried the whole thing by hand. If this kind of mystery pulls you in, subscribe and stay with me. Walk down into the trench and the picture gets worse, not better. The stone is not scattered by chance. It is set in a carved limestone enclosure, clean enough to feel planned, almost argued into place. The dust is pale, the air is dry, and the T-shaped megaliths rise out of the earth like the backs of something buried on purpose. That is what makes Göbekli Tepe so hard to place in the usual story. This is the pre-pottery Neolithic, and yet there is no farming village here. No metal, no wheel, no writing. Just people who somehow knew how to quarry, move, and stand these blocks with real precision. And once you see the carvings up close, lions, foxes, snakes, birds, the place stops looking like a random camp and starts looking like a decision, a big one. Because now the question is not only how they built it is who kept them fed while they did it. And why a world that had not yet learned to farm would commit itself to this hill at all. And when you stand close enough to see the cuts, the mystery gets sharper. The carvings are deep, deliberate, almost stubborn in the stone. A fox here, a snake there, a bird with its body turned just so, all inside a carved limestone enclosure that should not exist in a world this early. Göbekli Tepe, the temple older than agriculture, feels less like a ruin and more like a message someone never meant to explain twice. Because a place like this does not happen by accident. It needs planning, work crews, food, time. It needs people who know where the stone comes from, how to move it, where to set it, and when to stop. That means the old picture of first farms, then temples starts to wobble. Hard. And there is one more thing that makes the hill even stranger. This is not the only place like it. Not even close. Around it, other mounds are starting to speak, and they all point to the same uncomfortable question. Who was organizing this whole landscape? That wider landscape changes everything. Once this hill stopped being treated as a single oddity, the pattern began to show itself in the dust. Nearby places like Karahan Tepe and Nevali Cori started to matter in a new way. Different mound, same region, and echoes of the same thinking in stone. Not copies, not tourist attractions from one age to another, but parts of a cultural field that now gets grouped under the name Taş Tepeler, the stone hills. You can feel the weight of that shift. One strange sanctuary is a puzzle. A cluster is a system. And systems mean routes, memory, repeated gatherings, shared symbols. They mean people returning to certain hills again and again, carrying stories, skills, and maybe obligations. That is where Göbekli Tepe stops looking like an isolated miracle and starts looking like one visible node in a much older map. Now add one more uncomfortable fact. Near this same region, around Karachadar, researchers traced the origins of early wheat. And suddenly, the old order of things starts to tilt. Was farming feeding the shrine, or did the shrine help create farming? That question is where the hill starts arguing back. The old model is neat, almost too neat. First, people learn to farm. Then they settle. Then, once food is secure, they have time for monuments, priests, and sacred spaces. But this place sits in the middle of that sequence like a stone jammed in a door. Its dates run back to around 9600 BCE, and the main use of the site continues for centuries after that, far earlier than Stonehenge, far earlier than the pyramids. So if the gatherings came first, the pressure changes direction. You no longer have farming producing ritual by accident. You may have ritual creating the need for steady food. A seasonal meeting place, a sacred hill, a repeated return. That could force people to manage grain, store it, protect it, and come back again. And remember where this is happening. Not in some random corner, but close to Karachada, where the ancestry of early wheat points back to the same region. That does not prove the case, but it does something more dangerous. It makes the standard timeline look reversible. And once you let that possibility in, the hill changes character again. It stops being just a structure and starts behaving like a meeting point. You can almost hear the logic of it in reverse. Groups arriving over ridges, feet grinding chalky soil, fires smoking at dusk, people returning because this place mattered enough to return to. But something strong enough to pull scattered communities into the same orbit. That matters, because repeated gatherings do things to human life. They create schedules, they create obligations, they create memory outside the family camp. If enough people are coming back to the same place season after season, then somebody has to plan for food, water, labor, and order. In other words, the social machinery starts before the classic signs of civilization show up in the textbook. And that is where the site becomes dangerous to the old story. Maybe settlement did not begin with comfort. Maybe it began with pressure. The need to assemble, to perform, to feed a crowd, to honor something fixed on a hill. Then comes the move no one expected. Because after all that effort, they covered it, deliberately. And that act is in the soil itself. The fill between the pillars does not look like slow collapse. It is packed, mixed, intentional. Stone chips, soil, broken material, ordinary debris, all of it pushed into spaces that had once been open. This is what people mean when they talk about deliberate backfill. Someone closed these circles by hand. Now think about what that means. The same culture that cut the pillars, carved the animals, and maintained the hill also chose to hide it. Whole enclosures gone under layers of earth. That is not forgetfulness. That is a decision. The air around this mystery gets heavier right here, because burial changes the emotional meaning of the place. If it were only a building project, abandonment would be enough. But this feels closer to sealing, retiring, maybe even protecting. And yet, none of those words really settles it. Why bury a sacred place you still remember? Why erase it so thoroughly that the ground itself has to keep the secret? Unless the burial was part of the message. So now the buried hill starts pointing beyond itself. Because once you widen the circle, Göbekli Tepe stops looking alone. Nearby mounds like Karahan Tepe and Nevali Cori begin to fit into the same pattern, with the same rough logic of stone, gathering, and return. The place is no longer a single odd monument. It is part of a regional horizon, a pre-pottery Neolithic world that seems to have shared both ideas and habits. And that is where the wheat matters. Around Karajada, the traces of early domesticated grain sit uncomfortably close to this whole stone landscape. You can almost feel the pressure between the two facts. People gathering in sacred space, and people learning to manage food around it. If that sounds backwards, that is because it is. The usual story says farming made temples possible. Here, the temple may have made farming necessary. But if a sacred network helped force the first grain fields into existence, then the next question gets darker. Who taught the first builders to look at the land that way? Maybe no one had to teach them in the formal sense. A place like this can grow out of repetition. Return to the same ridge often enough. Mark the same sky often enough. Tell the same stories beside the same stone faces often enough. And knowledge hardens without writing a single line. That is one of the most important things this site forces us to remember. No script does not mean no system. The hill shows planning everywhere you look. In the way the circles are laid out, in the way the pillars face inward, in the way the carvings repeat certain animals and not others. Even the silence of the place says something. This was a world with memory, rules, and probably ritual specialists, even if they left no names behind. That is why the old language of simple hunter-gatherers starts to sound thin here. The people of this landscape may not have had cities yet, but the stones suggest they had coordination, symbolism, and timing on a scale we still struggle to fit into the textbook. And once you accept that, one carved pillar begins to look less like decoration and more like an argument in stone. That argument is where the story becomes more dangerous and more fragile. One pillar in particular keeps pulling people back, not because it solves the site, but because it refuses to stay quiet. On its surface, you get a crowded scene, animals, symbols, shapes arranged in a way that feels organized rather than decorative. A scorpion stands out, birds appear, other figures seem placed with intent, not scattered at random. Now, this is where caution matters. Some researchers read that panel as ritual imagery full stop. Others think the arrangement may preserve something more specific, maybe a memory, maybe a coded sequence, maybe even a sky reference. That last idea is the one that gets attention, and the one that sparks the most argument. Because if a pillar here carries more than myth, then the stones are doing something we usually reserve for later cultures. They are storing information in a durable form, without writing. That does not make the interpretation proven. But once you see how deliberate the scene looks, you start to understand why the debate around this hill refuses to die, and why the next layer of the mystery reaches far beyond ritual alone. That next layer opens onto a colder possibility. Some of the people studying this place have asked whether certain carvings preserve memory of the sky, not as astronomy in the modern sense, but as remembered signs tied to a specific event. And this is where the argument brushes up against a much larger debate, because the late Ice Age was not calm. Around the end of that world, climate shifted fast. Temperatures dropped, landscapes changed, animal ranges moved. Human communities would have felt that in their bones. Now, be careful here. This does not mean one pillar has been decoded, and it does not mean every symbol points to a comet or a disaster. Those claims go too far, too fast. But it does mean the site exists close to a period when memory of real environmental shock could still have mattered deeply. If that memory survived in ritual, in story, in where people gathered and what they carved, then the burial of the enclosures may have something to do with what these communities believed had already happened once and what they feared could happen again. And that possibility changes the burial from strange to urgent. If a community believes the world can turn on it, then covering a sacred place starts to look different than abandonment or tidying up after a ritual life has ended. The soil packed into those spaces could mean closure, protection, even controlled memory, as if the place had to be sealed rather than left open to weather, animals, or strangers. You can hear scholars split right at this point. One side leans toward ritual retirement, a sanctuary used, honored, then formally ended. Another leans toward practical change, climate shifts, social shifts, people moving on. Both explanations have weight. Neither one fully explains the care, the scale, the effort of the burial. Because remember what was being hidden. Not a hut or a fire pit, but massive pillars, carved surfaces, arranged space. A place that had already consumed labor over generations. To cover all that by hand is work again. Serious work. So the hill leaves us with an unsettling thought. Maybe the most important act of this culture was not raising the stones. Maybe it was deciding that the stones should disappear. And that is why the site keeps pulling people past the easy explanations. If Göbekli Tepe, the temple older than agriculture, was buried on purpose, then the ending of the story is part of the story itself. The builders did not just leave stone behind, they made a choice about memory. They decided what the ground should keep and what it should hide. That is a very different act from ruin. Ruin happens to a place. This feels directed. It feels like a last move in a long argument between the people and the hill, with the carved limestone enclosure now answering from under the soil instead of above it. And because of that, every new trench matters. Every layer can change the whole reading. A loose stone, a packed patch of earth, a shifted pillar, any one of them could tilt the story again. So when archaeologists say the hill still has most of its secret buried, they are not being poetic. They mean it. And the next secret may be the one that explains why the builders vanished from their own monument in the first place. And if that is true, then the people around it were already thinking in ways our textbooks flatten out. A carved limestone enclosure does not happen in a vacuum. It takes return visits, shared timing, and some kind of rule that keeps the work moving. That means the old label of simple hunters is too small for what the hill is showing us. In the pre-pottery Neolithic, memory may have lived in stone, in roots, in repeated seasons, in the way people gathered and listened. That is the part we keep missing. A culture can be powerful without a line of text. It can pass knowledge mouth to mouth, hand to hand, generation to generation, until the ground itself becomes part of the record. So when you stand under those pillars, you are not looking at ignorance. You are looking at a world that knew how to remember without paper. And if they could do that, then the next question is worse. What else about their world was deliberately left out of sight? So the whole thing comes back to the same ugly question. If a culture can build a place like this, use it, and then bury it on purpose, then the line between before civilization and after civilization starts to blur. Göbekli Tepe, the temple older than agriculture, is no longer just a monument. It is evidence that memory, order, and long planning existed far earlier than the simple ladder we were taught. And that should make us uncomfortable, because it means the people around this hill were not waiting to become human in the modern sense. They were already making hard choices about land, labor, belief, and what should survive. The carvings, the pillars, the deliberate backfill, they all point to a culture with a deeper grip on the world than the old labels allow. Something older than written history or city history, tighter and harder to recover. Which leaves one last problem hanging in the air. If they could choose what to hide so carefully, what else from that world is still waiting under the soil? And that is why the work still feels unfinished. The trench is not some tidy museum floor. It is open earth, heat, dust, stone edges catching the light, and every season there is one more layer that changes the reading. Around Göbekli Tepe, the temple older than agriculture, the ground still behaves like a locked drawer that has not given up its second key yet. That is the hard truth for archaeology here. The site already broke the old timeline once, but it did not stop there. Every new cut, every new patch of fill, every new exposed surface can push the story in a different direction. One circle may explain a little, another may undo it. So the scholars keep coming back, careful and stubborn, because they know how much is still hidden. The whole Taş Tepeler landscape keeps hinting that the pattern is bigger than one sanctuary, bigger than one debate. And if the next enclosure tells a different story than the last one, then the real answer has been waiting under our feet all along. And that is where the hill stops being only about the past. Because the deeper lesson is not just that the timeline may be wrong, it is that whole chapters of human experience can vanish so completely that later people mistake them for impossibility. A place can stand for centuries, shape behavior, pull communities together, then sink under earth until the world forgets the kind of mind that made it. You can feel that unease in the silence around the stones. Wind over dry grass, dust in the throat, sunlight on cut limestone, and almost nothing else left. No names, no voices, no written defense of what they built or why they sealed it. That absence is what makes this place more than an archaeological puzzle. It is a warning about how little survives when memory is carried in fragile things, bodies, rituals, seasons, routes across land. So before we leave the trench, there is one final question hanging over Göbekli Tepe, the temple older than agriculture. And this one is not really about them at all. So here is the final turn. The deepest challenge of Göbekli Tepe, the temple older than agriculture, is not that it gives us one shocking answer. It is that it forces us to admit how easily a working world can fall out of view. A network of sacred hills, a people who organized labor before cities, a culture strong enough to raise stone and then hide it again. And after enough time, all of that can shrink to a puzzle under dry grass. That is the real weight of this place. Just the blunt fact that human complexity can exist, vanish, and leave behind only fragments tough enough to survive weather and forgetting. A pillar stays standing. The hands that planned it do not. By evening, the shadow of one stone stretches across the trench, like the hand of a clock with no numbers left on its face. The wind keeps moving. Dust settles back into the cuts, and the hill goes quiet again. If this kind of buried history is your thing, stay close to the channel. There are more places like this waiting under the surface.